Hi guys, welcome back to the next episode of Don't Fear the Wait with me, your tiny titan host, Vicky Masita. I am in my bedroom today because my office is being torn apart by some builders. So you might hear people singing and that kind of thing. My builders are very, very lovely, but they can't sing to save their life. So if you do hear that, I do apologise. However, we will hopefully be gone with them very, very soon, and I shall be back in my little titan office, which is made out of my under the stairs cupboard, which is nice. It just kind of keeps me away from, children and husbands and dogs and things like that. So always about it. Right, I have a wonderful guest on the podcast with me today. Me and Lee have gone back quite a while now, isn't it? We've known each other. But I'm going to pass over to Lee so he can actually explain who he is and the fact that what he does, and he's a nice little researcher and he does his PhD and everything else. But I'm going to let him do all of that introductions, and then we shall tell you exactly what we are going to be talking about today on the podcast. So Lee, over to you, my man. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm all right, thanks. Yeah, this is pretty cool. So I guess just to reiterate, when did we met for a couple of years back, didn't we? But I was a big fan of the podcast before I met you. I think that was the reason why I reached out initially. So it's kind of cool to be invited on. So I really do appreciate it. So in terms of my introduction, currently I'm a lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. I am involved, I guess, primarily in the kind of physiology and strength and conditioning related modules. Been doing that a couple of years now. I really enjoy it. And like you've already alluded to, that allows me to do research projects in those areas, kind of test the things that I want to test rather than waiting for the studies to come out, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Being involved in that kind of primary research is always quite, it's fun, but it has its own issues, which I'm sure we'll delve into when we get into the meat of the podcast. I've been in the industry a while now. Before lecturing, I've done, as you can imagine, the whole personal training circuit, strength and conditioning coach. I do little bits of consultancy now, but if I'm being honest, I'm more interested in what the coaches do and how we can optimize their performance with their athletes rather than the athletes themselves primarily.
Sure.
So I do as little as I can get away with. I'm conscious that it's still important to do bits of coaching, but I try and get away with a minimum if I'm being honest. As you know yourself, TRA performance is something that I am involved in on the fringes still. So we do run some fitness events from time to time, myself and Paul, that you've had on the podcast before, and obviously you've been involved in that as well.
Yeah.
I think that's it. Lots of different things going off at any one time, but I think that's the kind of core, that's the gist of what I'm up to right now.
Amazing. So basically the reason why I brought you on today is because you have decided, well, you didn't decide, you've been doing it for a while, haven't you? So you actually delved into the theory of overtraining. And I suppose the reason why I was so interested in this paper is because when I read it, I was like, actually, this makes a hell of a lot of sense in terms of overtraining with the strength. Well, I'll let you talk about it so much. But there has always been this theory of overtraining. Then there's been this theory of overreaching. Then there's been this other theory of people just basically saying that it doesn't exist and you don't realistically have to take deloads. You don't have to do overtraining because if you're clever and smart about your programming, you won't actually overtrain and you won't overreach. But then obviously the other side of the crew, especially with bodybuilders, is saying that you need to actually go to failure every single session, every single exercise in order to progress and hit the muscle fibers in the correct manner. So I suppose it's just trying to find that balance. And that's the reason why I was so excited when this paper finally came out and I got to read it. And I have to say, I did have to read it 2 or 3 times because you are way more intelligent than I am. So I needed to really kind of decipher everything as much as I possibly could. But what made you so interested in overreaching and overtraining to begin with? Let's talk about that first.
That's a really good way to put me up. That I really like that. I just use long words. I just have a really cool thesaurus that I delve into when I need to.
Depends to be more
the reason why I got into it was purely by accident, if I'm being honest. So little bit of background. So I did my undergrad in sports science, but I struggled with it a little bit. I wasn't motivated. I wasn't really enthusiastic about the undergrad for whatever reason. I didn't do very well. So I had a long gap from that degree to master's degree, kind of grown up a little bit, done a lot in industry and went through the mature student enrollment route. What I did to kind of correct the errors of my undergrad was during the MSc was just getting involved in all the different projects that I could, to the point where, you know, like as a, I think, what would I have been then? Like in my early 30s, I was in all the lab sessions just holding the RPE cards up, just thinking, I'm not learning anything, but I just want to be involved. So, you know, you've got like really high level elite athletes on treadmills doing tests, and I was just holding a card up going, well, so where are you on the RPE scale? 7, right, write it down, you know. That was what I did, just getting involved in everything. And there was an opportunity came up. One of the PhD students was doing some primary data testing. I think it was around female athlete triad. And I was given an opportunity to go in, be part of the lab team, but then also to use some of the data that we collected to write my own thesis. So a small team of us got together and we said, well, what could we use this data for? It was in high performing endurance athletes, all female, obviously looking at female athlete triad. Sure. But for whatever reason now, I can't remember what it was, they did have some male participants in. It was another study run in parallel. So I said, well, what's cool in endurance sports, male and female participants, retrospectively as I look back, not much, because I don't find endurance training that interesting. But that aside, what I did was we decided to look at some of the overtraining blood markers, which was a kind of a cool area of research, quite understudied back in, I think it was 2012. The team of us wrote a paper. It was okay as a thesis. I did all right. I think I corrected some of the errors of, you know, kind of tossing off the undergrad, if I'm being honest. Yeah. I enjoyed it. And then afterwards, my thesis supervisor said, you know, you've got one chapter in particular that looks really, really cool, and it's your literature review of the kind of the overtraining research as it stands. Do you want to work on it now together to try and get something that's publishable? Now, obviously, when you've just kind of finished your master's degree, you're not a published scientist, but you want to go into research. That's like the golden ticket. So I spent probably the best part of 18 months afterwards, you know, working hard on the lit review, going through all of the PRISMA guidelines to make sure the methodology was solid, writing up the results, you know, really enjoying the process, but still not really being in love with endurance training. Mm-hmm. And the overtraining literature is interesting because it appears like there are just as many reviews of the studies as there are studies themselves. So it was quite a time-consuming process. You know, lots of different reviews to sift through. There were over 200 primary studies that we had to look at. And, you know, as you'll know yourself, when you're looking at study methodologies, you'll have an inclusion criteria and an exclusion criteria. So every study that's coming through, I'm going, right, we'll include that because it's an endurance sport, which I think we were looking at things like long-distance swimming, marathon running, triathlons and things like that. And then anything that came through that was either an intermittent-based sport, you know, something like rugby or anything that was strength-based was going in the exclusion criteria pile. And as I'm going through all this, I'm going, well, this is weird because everything's going endurance. We've got little bits of team sport stuff, but there's nothing in the strength training category. And I found that quite worrying. And I ended up getting the paper published, which was great. But at the back of my mind, I was still, why is no one researching this in strength training when we know that the bioenergetics, that the skills, the qualities are all different? So that's then when I said, well, why don't I go back and do that research myself, again, rather than waiting for someone else to do it. So I applied to do a PhD at Sheffield Hallam, got on that, just got cracking with it, you know, which is where this first paper was born from. Worked out quite well because I ended up getting a lecturing job off the back of it anyway. And then we just decided to go with the exact same review, but we flipped the inclusion and exclusion criteria around. So anything that was based around endurance, we put that in the bin, and anything that was based around our own definition of strength sports, because that's in itself is a tentative term, we put in the paper. And that was the starting point, really. So purely by accident. So, you know, probably quite good that I messed my undergrad degree up, I guess. Yeah. Who knows?
So, I mean, it is good because I'm of the same boat of you, right? I find endurance sports really boring. I find it boring to watch. I find it boring to, I mean, suppose do as well. There's nothing that I would hate more than actually going for a long run. But realistically, endurance sports are where you find the biggest overtraining criteria, isn't it? More so in females. And like you were talking about with the female athlete triad, if people don't know what we're talking about with that, these are the things that include things like hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is also known as the loss of the menstrual cycle, severely underweight body weight, etc., etc. So this is what we're actually talking about when it comes to the female athlete triad. So when it comes to that, endurance athletes realistically suffer from the female athlete triad more so than athletes in strength sports, correct?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think we can make that assumption definitely. I think more so with the Reds model as opposed to the female athlete triad.
Yeah,
That's something that we're looking at now, and we're looking at what the commonalities between those two conditions. And that's a research project that I'm working on with a really good researcher actually based out in Brazil at Sao Paulo.
oh cool.
And we're looking at trying to stratify some of the commonalities to actually work out if overtraining is Reds and is Reds overtraining. We don't think it is, but we think they share more than enough common characteristics to be banded within the same category.
Oh cool.
So I think that's an interesting area of future research for sure.
Definitely.
Sorry,
for
but like you said,
don't know what Reds are, that is relative energy deficiency in sport. So basically what we're talking about here is not enough calories being available to warrant the amount of expenditure that an athlete is doing. So that's what Lee's talking about when he's talking about Reds. So sorry to interrupt there, carry on.
No, not all. This is really good. You like my own bibliography. It's fantastic.
Kind of intelligent.
And please chip in and put the definitions in for me. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that we found with the endurance literature was that there were huge autonomic disturbances. So, you know, if you talk about symptoms and risk factors of potential overtraining in endurance athletes, you know, changes to resting and max heart rates, changes in heart rate recovery, heart rate variability, changes in cytokine levels, and, you know, the kind of all the acute inflammatory phase stuff. But we weren't really finding any of that in the strength training literature, which again, I think justifies the need for specific overreaching, overtraining research in strength sports, because the symptoms are not the same. Now, I think both within the research, but also anecdotally, even on things like Instagram, when people are saying, like, what are the top 5 risk factors of overtraining? People always use the risk factors and the symptoms that are indicative of endurance training, not strength training. So for me, it's like, well, okay, but rather than trying to grab something from a completely different sport and pull it across or work with what we've got, why don't we just look more in a more detailed way at the strength training literature, and also to create more experiments to say, well, okay, well, firstly, how are strength training athletes training? What can we use as markers, either analytic objective markers with whatever data metric we use, or perceptual ones, because it's important to ask athletes how they feel, obviously, to see if we can create our own, you know, list of risks and symptoms to look out for.
So anecdotally then, obviously you being a strength and conditioning coach yourself, anecdotally, what would you say were the biggest things that shocked you with the literature compared to your anecdotal experience in terms of overtraining?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting you asked that, because I think coming from industry, I think I have a different way of looking at things and perceiving things as maybe someone that's gone undergrad, postgrad, PhD, lecturer, and now let's do research. And that's not to necessarily say that they're doing it wrong and I'm doing it right. I always think about, right, what research can I apply to practice? Now, sometimes you're able to do that and sometimes you're not, because you need to look at the mechanistic stuff first to then get an idea of why and what before you can then apply it to the how. So what was important for me was triangulating the research to look at, one, what does the previous research say? Secondly, what are the perceptions from athletes? So what do athletes feel are some of the risk factors that they use to track their own progress and, you know, risk identification? But then also the same thing from a coach's perspective as well, as being the authoritative figure. So triangulating between the three. The research paper was kind of going to have to go around the houses to answer this question, but the research paper was a scoping review, which is a type of review that not many people have heard of. I think if you ask people about review types in research, most will say, well, systematic review. You know, some might say narrative review. But a scoping review, its primary purpose is to look at data that's quite heterogeneous, so there's no real patterns. You know, you've got a couple of studies in powerlifting, a couple in jump sports, a couple in throw sports, all different methodologies, no common consensus, different types of participants. So it very, very loosely tracks what the consensus and conclusions are from all of those different studies, but then primarily trying it kind of flips things around and said, well, where are the gaps? What should we research next? Now that was really, for me, it was really interesting as an investigative tool, because it was right. Well, Dan, I can use this as a foundation, a springboard for future research. Not this is what we know, let's stick with it. It's this is what we know, but oh shit, this is what we don't know. We better start looking at this, like you say, either anecdotally or through future research projects. What we found with the data, there were only, I think, it's actually a long time since I submitted the paper, but I think there were 37 studies that were included in the paper. They were all weightlifting or resistance training, and there were one throw sport.
Yeah.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, by the way. There was nothing in powerlifting that primarily looked at overreaching or overtraining, or any of the other fringe sports that we'd included. The risk factors were, high volumes, high intensities for excessive amounts of time, training to failure. I don't think there was anything that was particularly surprising, to be honest. Low energy availability, which kind of ties back into the female athlete triad and the red stuff to a degree, but there wasn't much on that. Low carbohydrate diets. We didn't include, in our definition of strength sports, we didn't include bodybuilding because it's not a strength-based sport such, although it has obviously a resistance training component. We also didn't include CrossFit as well. And we had a very, very long series of discussions around whether we should include CrossFit. And in the end, we decided not to, because there's obviously a huge metabolic component as well. We wanted to look at those that were right at the end of the continuum for lifting a bar. And that only, with minimal kind of contribution to the metabolic stuff. But we did include it in the resistance training component of the study. There were all sorts of things in there. And we found that out of all of the research papers, there was only one that actually used a proper diagnostic tool for overtraining, and that was in CrossFit athletes. And there were quite a high proportion of those were classified as being overtrained. And the researcher, Flavio Cadigiani, he's called, fantastic researcher, great guy, very intelligent. He found that there was a really kind of strong link between those who were overtrained and those that were on kind of like paleo, low carbohydrate diets as well. So we can assume that would be a risk factor. It kind of ties into low energy availability potentially. So we started to map out all of these different things, of which we're in the process now of setting up, a series of primary investigations. But that's what we found for that paper. We were like, okay, there's a few things there. Some bits are interesting. Some bits, I think if you ask decent coaches, they'll go, yeah, we know that already. In fact, I'll tell you this one, my dad has no experience whatsoever in academia or sports science, but used to do a bit of football coaching, and he's a high-level jiu-jitsu athlete as well, or was back in his day. And he read the abstract of that review, and he just went, but we knew that 30 years ago. Like, yeah, cheers, Dad. Thanks for that. But he's right. So, the athlete paper, that was slightly different. So that I didn't lead on that paper. That was led by a researcher based at the University of Technology, Sydney, Clementine Grandau. She's called, fantastic researcher again. She's looking at very similar things to me. And we surveyed around 600 strength athletes. That was a broader category of strength training. So bodybuilding was included, CrossFit was included, just to get a perception of what they thought overtraining was. It's probably worth classifying at this point that if you take the common accepted consensus of what overtraining is right now, it's a decrease in performance that lasts for several weeks to months. So if you're tired for a few days, that's not overtraining, that's just, fatigue. But we wanted to say, well, what do athletes think about that? And, a lot of them were coming back saying, in fact, the actual percentages were, out of those 600 odd that we surveyed, 70.9 said that they had suffered some kind of underperformance. So we were like, okay, well, that's a lot. That's worryingly a lot of strength athletes. But then when we broke it down into time points, the vast majority of those were considered to be fixed within a 4-week period. So that's just an acute fatigue, potentially slightly overreached athlete. Whereas those that were more into the kind of 4 months and onwards, recovery time, which would be considered true overtraining syndrome, it was only around 4%.
Oh, wow.
So,
okay.
Which doesn't, it kind of doesn't go along what we found in the scoping review, but also what we thought we might find as well. So all of a sudden, you kind of sit back and you scratch your head and you're like, okay, well, maybe as researchers, we need to move the goalpost. Maybe it's not this true overtraining that's the issue. maybe the issue is more around this kind of accumulative fatigue into overreaching. And so that was really interesting. Now, what was even more interesting was from those 70.9% of strength athletes that said that they suffered from a performance decrement, the vast majority, I think it was 90 odd percent, said that they also felt that they had additional non-training stressors. So it wasn't all about high volume, high intensity, high frequency training. It was about having to deal with that whilst being stressed at work, or, you know, having family commitments, or, you know, all the kind of stuff that real people have to deal with when you're not a sponsored athlete.
Sure.
So that was really, really interesting. Again, you kind of think about, well, how do we change the goalpost now? And how do we look at this kind of like allostatic model of stress is stress, you know, and this ability to tolerate high levels of training whilst being stressed, and the fact that, well, we just can't do that, can we, you know? So that was what we found from the second paper. If anyone wants a copy of these papers, by the way, we can obviously send them on. The third one we're just finishing data collection now. That's the one where we interviewed coaches. So I can't tell you everything about it for two reasons. One, because I can't, because it's not published, and secondly, because I haven't finished the data analysis yet. But that was a thematic analysis. That was semi-structured interviews. We interviewed 14 high-performance coaches. I was going to use the word elite level coaches, but I still don't think we quantify the word elite athlete very well. Okay. So we went with high performance coaches. So basically coaches that have trained athletes to at least national standard in powerlifting, weightlifting, throws, jumps, sprinting, those kind of sports. Yeah. And because it's semi-structured interviews, it's essentially just like a glorified podcast like this. We just have a chat. We try and identify really cool areas to talk about, and those were related to very loosely overreaching and overtraining. Okay. You know, what do you think overtraining is? What do you think your definition is? Because at the back of my mind, I wanted to see whether these coaches, spoiler, no, it wasn't. It was completely different by the vast majority. Yeah. And then also to look at, you know, how many of them use tactics like purposeful overreachers, where they might, you know, for short periods of time have an impact cycle of increased training frequency and then by proxy increased training volume, periods of high intensity, or a combination of the two, to try and, you know, kind of wrestle and tease out additional supercompensation effects or increased performance effects. And we had some really interesting conversations there. And I think there was an even split between those that did purposely, you know, smash athletes hard, because they knew that once they created a deload and they came out the other side, that there'd be either a small or large increase in performance. Yeah. Or those that said, you know, I'm aware of it as a tactic and the history of it, but it's too risky, because the only way you can tell whether you've superimposed on too much training load is retrospectively. So basically you're flying blind. Have more training, have more training, have more training. Let's keep our fingers crossed. And then you might come out of the other side being better. Or it might be, oh shit, we actually gave you a little bit too much. And now I'm having to give you so much of a longer deloading period that you're losing all of those gains that you worked hard to create in the first place. Sure. That was really interesting. So I think, I said I was going to go around the houses with that answer, but to kind of triangulate everything across, there seems to be a real big disruption between what's happening in the research and actually what coaches are doing in real life. That to me is concerning, but cynically is also really exciting, because that means I can fill that gap now, to start to go away and say, right, how are you lot training? Because that's the intervention that I'll create and then monitor, rather than using some of the stuff that's been in research where, in all honesty, it's just not how real athletes train, you know?
Yeah. What is interesting, and what I'd like to actually know, I don't know if you'll actually be able to answer the question or not, based on the fact that it isn't a published paper yet. But when you did those interviews with the coaches, if they use a tactic as purposeful overreaching or purposeful addition of volume and that kind of thing, did you actually ask how they got to communicate with their athletes throughout that period of purposeful overtraining? So like how they actually coached them?
Yeah, I did, because that was really important to me. I have, my brain is a little bit, there's all sorts of stuff going off at any one time, to be honest. Some of it's useful and the vast majority of it isn't, if I'm being honest, which is why I was late for this podcast today. That's a different discussion. But I'm really interested in the coach-athlete relationship and how you can get optimal buy-in from athletes. I think that that's really, really important. And I think we've seen a lot from, for example, the work of John Keeley around the importance of athlete buy-in and the trust and the bond between the coach and the athlete. So for me, it was important to ask questions around how do you create that buy-in, but how do you actually coach someone when you're going into this process where it is risky and you are flying blind? And there was, I think if you were to categorize all of your monitoring tools into either the analytic objective method, so that could be like tracking bar velocity, or very rarely, but some were doing blood measures, 1 rep maxes, all of those things where it's, you get a number, yeah, and you can track that number. And those that were more perceptual. So it was either, and I found this was phenomenally interesting, but again, it was just like, well, yeah, we know that because that's what people do. Was coaches either using their own intuition by going, why do I need to stick something on the end of the bar to track someone's velocity when I know them that well? When they walk through the door, I know if they're knackered or not.
Yeah.
You know, or those that were just saying, I use the metrics, I use the analytical metrics to basically act as a door to a larger conversation. So, you know, the athlete comes in, you're like, how are you feeling today? Pretty shit, coach. All right, suck it up. We're in the middle of an impact cycle. Get warmed up and off you go. And then either after the warm-up, the athlete's like, cheers, coach, I actually feel phenomenal now. So thanks for not putting me on some kind of auto-regulated deload. Or they were like, yeah, I feel a little bit shit. And be like, okay, well, I'll tell you what, start your training session. Let's look at some of the metrics. Having a look and you're like, all right, yeah, we can see there's something not right. So let's sit down and have a conversation, and then I'll use my intuition. I think we run the risk at the moment as a complete industry in relying too much on some of these analytical tools like heart rate variability and heart rate tracking in general, where we go, you know what, that number's told me this, therefore that's going to tell me what my session is today.
Yeah.
And you'll know this from your own training and from your own coaching. Sometimes someone can walk in the gym and they feel pretty beat up and they feel pretty broken, and automatically your kind of gut feeling is, maybe we need to take it easy. But then they go and hit a PR, and you just
Exactly.
science is tough. Like how do you track that kind of thing? Because you can't do it using, you know, data, particularly a single metric. And so I found that really interesting. I found it devastating in my naivety. I wanted to create a small battery of tests where I could go and use that with your athletes, and that will tell you whether they're overreached, overtrained, fatigued, or just being lazy. When in reality, the vast majority of coaches will go, that's cool, but you know what? I'm just going to ask them if they're all right today and base it off that. Yeah. So again, like my journey so far has just been this complete movement of goalposts, because where I started is not where I am now. Where I am now is not going to be where I will be next month, I'm sure, or next year, or the year after that. So it's exciting where we're at. It's worrying in that not many people are researching this stuff right now. But you know, if there are people that are listening and they want to get into research, it's just a goldmine of research possibilities, because the link between acute and chronic fatigue is phenomenally interesting and you know, an underrepresented area of research.
Definitely. And especially when it can be coincided as well with nutrition. Did you have a look or actually speak to any of the coaches, what they do with their athletes in terms of nutrition? Because I do know, I mean, I'm very aware of it, obviously, because I am a nutrition performance coach, as you well know. But there are some athletes that I have who have their own strength coach, their own powerlifting, strongman coach, whatever, and I just deal with their nutrition because their strength and conditioning coach does not know about nutrition and does not want to deal with it. So do you find that had a big crossover effect? And did you include any nutrition coaches for the nutritional element of it?
No, we didn't. And that was purely down to time, resources, and also the kind of ethical considerations of what we're allowed to do within one specific research paper, I guess. Of course, we asked, I say we, Royal we, because I did all the data collection, the interviews. I asked questions around what do you look out for as risk factors, and you know, unsurprisingly, it was if we've got an athlete that is above their weight category and they need to decrease rapidly, that's something that we need to be aware of, so they don't tend to run an impact cycle during a weight cutting period, because that's nonsensical. So there were very general conversations around, so then how do you manage that? And I think because you get to a point where, I mean, some of the coaches I spoke to, like, obviously anonymization can't name names and stuff, but these are world leading coaches, and they are experts at what they do, but they're also very, very aware of where their limitations are.
Yeah.
So the conversations around nutrition very quickly turn into, they have their own nutritionist, and we just, talk as part of a multi or an interdisciplinary team. Or that athlete's an unfunded athlete. I only get an hour with them, every couple of days. We haven't got time to talk about nutrition. So I just trust that they do that themselves properly. And then I'll just run body comp tests, or we'll talk about it during training. So, there's concerns potentially there. But I think sometimes it's that disconnect between what you want to see and hear, but what actually happens in the real world of sports, where not every athlete has access to a nutritionist, when in reality they should do, if they're going to achieve optimal performance. But yeah, some of them just don't.
No, and it's extremely scary as well, especially in terms of weight making sports and weight categorized sports, because what I found realistically, when I see athletes being overtrained, or, in quotation marks, overtrained, or their perception of being overtrained or overreached, is 9 times out of 10, they're not overreached or overtrained. They're just under recovered. And they're under recovered because of this lack of energy availability, because they just kind of think, right, well, I need to be in this particular weight category, and the carbs are bad, carbs are the devil, and keto is the way forward, but I need to be within a certain caloric amount or intake. But because keto is the key, I'm not actually eating a great deal of food for my 1,600 calories or whatever it is to be a 52 kilo powerlifter. And so they're not having a great volume of food at the same time. So all they're doing is just basically becoming acidotic in a way, because they're having to break down all of their lean muscle tissue as well. So they're catabolizing everything that they have worked so hard on to do it. And I do find that strength and conditioning coaches just give out some, and I'm not talking about, anybody in particular like we're talking about with anonymity, but a lot of strength and conditioning coaches literally just give them some blanket advice by saying, well, just eat a high protein diet and not a lot else, in your peaking cycle, which is extraordinarily concerning, really. Do you think realistically that the under recovery, or the recovery curve, should we say, has got a lot more to do with energy availability and caloric intake as opposed to weight lifted?
There's a few different points I want to cover on that. So the first one is, so you used overtraining or overtraining as a verb, then as an actual doing word. So the process of training harder than you can recover from.
Yeah.
Now, to me, that's important, because we have overtraining as the verb. So like I said, training harder than you can recover, but we have overtraining syndrome, which is this multifactorial, medically diagnosed disorder. And I can see why the two would, and rightly so. Common sense, it's the same word. And I mentioned this in a podcast previously, and they were laughing, but they were like, actually, you're right. I still do a lot of research on Instagram. So it's all right reading like loads of journals and stuff. But again, it comes back to that. I'm really interested in what people perceive overtraining to be. So I follow the hashtag of overtraining, and it's always, I'm overtraining, and it's someone doing a heavy bench. And I'm like, I wonder what makes you think that word would be an appropriate word there. So for me, it's like, right, how do we deal with this? If as scientists, it's our job to educate lay people, athletes who are training, we're not doing a great job because they're not using the words properly. So what do? So overtraining, training over the amount that you can recover from, that makes sense. Overtraining syndrome probably doesn't, because there's more to it than just training. We talked about stress is stress, and we've already seen that your tolerance to deal and cope and recover from training load is diminished when you have those non-training stressors. Back in, I think it was 2000, they tried to change, or at least create, a new term for the overtraining syndrome, which was the unexplained underperformance syndrome. It's a little bit more of a mouthful, but it never really caught on. But it would have been a cool shift again, because we then have overtraining and we have underperformance syndrome, completely two different things. But it never took off. And then there was a new one. Again, it was Flavio actually that came up with it, and it was the paradoxical deconditioning syndrome. And that was, I think, last year in a paper. Great term, paradoxical deconditioning, because that's what happens. You're training harder and harder and harder, or at least your perceived effort is going up, but you're becoming deconditioned.
Yeah.
but it's a bit of a mouthful, and I don't think it'll take off. Paradoxical deconditioning syndrome or overtraining. So I
Yeah.
don't think it'll take off, but I think we need to redefine what the actual syndrome is before we can even start to test it, if that makes sense. So that's the first thing there that I think is of value, because I think overtraining is the right term to use. What was the second thing? That was it. So when we're talking about the under recovery, so we know that when we apply a single bout of training, we get two things occur. We get the adaptive process that triggers almost instantaneously straight away, that will eventually lead to an increase in performance. And obviously, the more regular we train and the harder we train, the more adaptation we create. But we also create this surplus, this fatiguing effect, which the model is called the fitness fatigue model. I think it was created by Bannister. And we can manipulate those two curves. We can manipulate the curve that obviously to recover from fatigue by the type of training. So we know that if it's very high intensity but very low volume, we can recover within minutes to hours.
Yeah.
We know that if the type of training is muscle damaging training, so that could be like a novel stimulus or really high volumes or loads of eccentric training, things like that, that the recovery takes hours, if not lots and lots of days to recover from. Again, we've all been there. It's awful, but we've all trained a little bit too hard. So we can manipulate the curve for fatigue by the way we train, and we can manipulate it to a degree by how we recover. We have that whole kind of make sure you're eating properly, make sure you're in a calorie surplus, you're sleeping well, you manage all your stress and things like that. Those are the biggest kind of bang for your buck things. And then we have all of that peripheral, like ice baths and various machines and like those guns that hit your muscles and stuff that probably have little to no serious, beneficial effects. But even if it's a placebo, that in itself is a powerful tool.
Sure.
And then in terms of flip that around, the adaptive process, we know that we can change that by the type of training. So if we move a bar fast, we'll get a different adaptation to if we move a heavy bar slow. We know that if we train in a particular way, we'll get hypertrophy, whereas if we train a different way, we might avoid hypertrophy, but we can increase strength. All those different things, like basic common sense training approach. So the under recovery can be manipulated, but the further we move away from our kind of initial starting point, the more training load we have to apply, because we keep having to layer more and more on to get those marginal gains. And then that's when we risk this kind of underperformance, because we can't get away with training twice a week and going, oh, well, I can actually see a little bit of growth, or my 1 rep max has increased. We're having to train, several times a week, if not a couple of times a day, just to get an extra kilo on the bar sometimes. So inherently, what comes with chasing those adaptations is this surplus, this superimposed effect of fatigue. And that's what we're trying to manage. And that's, I guess, what I'm interested in right now is what is that tolerable level? And can you actually say definitively that's enough? Because all you're doing now is layering on unnecessary fatigue for the sake of it, and you're not actually going to get any functional gains. The third thing, does it tie into the energy availability? I would imagine so. I would imagine if you were to run an experiment, I have several experiment ideas in my head, but I can hardly get any through ethics, if I'm being honest. But one of them is to get two groups of athletes and smash the shit out of them hard, like train them hard, but don't give one of them a calorie surplus and give one a really aggressive deficit and see what happens. Well, we know what's going to happen, but we've never really seen it. We've only seen it anecdotally. We've not seen it within the science. We've seen it observationally, but we've never seen it as an intervention. So that to me would be really cool. But again, within the overtraining stuff, you either have to do it observationally. So you have to just go and see what a coach is doing in their natural habitat and sit in the corner and make notes and go, oh, right, okay, we're seeing a pattern here. Or you try to tentatively get something through an ethical process through a panel, an ethics panel, when they go, you want to do what with these athletes?
Yeah.
You're like, that will not fly. And even if it was to get through ethics, even if you managed to get it through, the coaches would then just go, but why would I let my athlete come with you, train hard to the point where it might take them several weeks to months to recover? You're going to ruin their season. And I'm going to extrapolate this from the endurance literature, but then there's something like a 90 to 91% reoccurrence rate in overtraining as well. Yeah. So once you've overtrained them, they'll overtrain again the next season, the next season, the next season. You basically ruin the career.
Sure.
So, we've had lots of different conversations about how can we get something through ethics which will purposely overreach somewhat, they will see huge amounts of fatigue, but it will dissipate quickly enough for us not to have any long-lasting, detrimental effects on the athletes, because that's not what we want, obviously. There's some stuff back in the 90s. I have no idea how he got through ethics. Andy Fry, Professor Andy Fry, did a load of research in the late 90s through to kind of like 2006, 2007, where he applied what was it now? It was 10 1-rep max back squats each day, every day for 2 weeks.
Nice.
And just kind of let that sit in. That's a lot. That's a lot of training, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how that got through ethics, because I've tried to get stuff half as intense as that through, and they've just gone, no, sort your life out. Come back next week. But I would love to be a participant in that. But the freaky thing is that some were overreached, but some actually got better. I just can't get my head around that at all. Which again, I think that just comes back to there's a huge inter-individual effect. What will overreach someone will actually make someone else better, but you won't know that until you've actually applied that stimulus in the first place.
Definitely. And I've seen that anecdotally as well in my coaching. So I have to actually coach all of my athletes in a very, very different way. I myself, personally speaking, I need to be exposed to heavy 1-rep max stimuli very frequently, because otherwise I'll lose it. So I almost detrain from that strength ability, which is odd. But then I'll have other people that I literally cannot put more than 90% of their 1-rep max in their hands up until their peaking strategy. And even then, we're not going to do any more than 90%, and we're just going to do lots and lots of heavy singles at 90% until they get onto the platform, because they seriously just cannot function with it. So I suppose it does have to come down to each individual athlete. And I have seen as well massive differences between male and female athletes when it comes to strength sports. Definitely so, especially when it comes to putting a 1-rep max in their hand. Have you seen that as well in your past history, as well as, well, I don't know whether you put it in this one?
Not in terms of my past history, no. Again, anecdotally discussing with coaches, the way, I mean, again, we can come back to, we both chat a lot with Lyle, don't we? And, the great way that he's doing with female athletes, tolerance to, sub-maximal volumes is better and all that kind of stuff. And the way that we might phrase a deload as well. So, for example, this is from my experience, but also anecdotally, is that females will detrain much quicker during a deload if they don't have just that little bit more volume compared to males. Like little things like that are difficult to study when your participant bank is males and females. Oh. And, we know that within STEM research that there's far less female researchers and research participants than what there should be. But sometimes it's easier within the research to test males because it's very simple creatures. There isn't much change from month to month, week to week. I think the next stage for us is to look, obviously, once we've looked at some of the review documents around REDS, female athlete tried and training, is to look specifically within females. I know you said right at the beginning about, females possibly having a higher incidence of overtraining, or at least a higher risk of overtraining. I think if you look through the statistics of the endurance data, that's true. The problem I have in my mind is there's far less studies including females overall. So is that potential to skew the data? That's what we have to kind of consider. So the data says maybe at the moment, but I just think there needs to be more primary research on it. There's just nothing in strength athletes. There's just nothing using female. Well, no, actually, that's a lie. There's 1 or 2 studies, very small banks of participants.
Yeah.
So that'll be the next stage, I think. So, soon, within the next few months, hopefully, once we get out of lockdown, I have a few studies that I want to recruit for, which will just be basically, do you want to come to the gym and I will hit you with such a hard series of training sessions that you will not like life? Do you want to come and do it? Because I reckon we might get some. But, I think we'll look at some. I reckon so. Now, what I've done with that as well is, have I been clever? Or I might be tooting my own horn a little bit here, but I've purposely said I don't want to test strength athletes for that study. Okay. Anyone that's recreationally well-trained. So basically, I can't remember the data now, but I think it was something like being able to, for the males, it was squat double body weight. For the females, I think it was 1.5 as a rep max. and must have trained, I think it was maybe 3 or 4 times a week for the last 2 years with weights, something like that. So quite well trained, but recreationally, so they don't have to be an athlete. And I did that for 2 reasons. One is there's no risk of training someone that hard that it ruins that career or the meet that they've got coming up. But secondly, I just reckon we might get a few bodybuilders who just go, "You're not breaking me." And I'll go, "Oh, I will. I will.
Yeah.
You come and do this study." And again, can't talk a lot about it, but we managed to get this one through ethics because technically speaking, it's actually not purposely overtraining someone. It's just 1 or 2 very, very huge training sessions in quick succession that will get someone mega sore for a few days, but won't have any long-lasting negative impacts. If that goes well and we start to see things like, okay, so what's the recovery of bar velocity? What's the recovery of 1RM? We'll look at some of the proxy measures like creatine kinase, maybe myoglobin. We'll look at perceived recovery as well, because we already talked about perceived recovery is important. Then what we'll do is we'll say, right, back to ethics. Can we run that same training protocol again, but can we add more sessions on and more and more and more? And let's actually see what happens to all of these analytical and objective and perceptual measures. Who knows? It might work, it might not do. But I think it'll be really interesting. And it's just been me sat in the corner just laughing as people are failing set after set after set, but kind of going, "This is cool." And I'm going, "I know it's cool. I've got the data right here."
That's funny. Oh, I'll definitely look forward to seeing how that one goes. Definitely.
I've got your name down. You're doing it.
Possibly not. I don't know. I'll think about it. See what I'm doing that day, if I'm washing my hair or not.
Yeah.
Right, so we are just about up on time here, Lee. So what I'd like to do is I will put in all of your contact details underneath the podcast as per usual. But is there anything that you'd like to leave the podcast on? Maybe just like a little bit of an anecdotal idea of what to look out for with overtraining with strength athletes?
Yeah, sure. I think it's more at this stage. It's more important to listen to your own body than to be led by some app or some external metric. But I also think that you need to listen to your body in context of what your actual training goal is as well. So we run the risk, I think, at the moment within our industry of being too prophylactic, too preventative, and being scared of recovery. And I think, again, you go through Instagram, Facebook, whatever social media, and it's always about recovery is more important than training.
Yeah.
Like, well, not really. Sedentary people recover more than they train, and that isn't working. It's important, but there might be certain phases of training where the idea is that you are layering on so much of a stimulus that you won't be recovered. And that is then when you have to suck it up. And it's like, "Oh man, I feel pretty shit today." Well, that's going to happen because of the type of training that you employ. Whereas, if you're in a peaking phase or a deload or any other kind of generic part of the training program, if you are feeling a little bit beat up and your motivation's going down, you just don't feel as keen to hit the gym as what you might normally do, how does that work for you? Do you need a day or 2 off? Or is it just a case of you need to look yourself in the mirror, have a word with yourself and just go, "I know this is how I feel. I know this is part of my game plan, but I also know that once I've got my warm-up done, I'm going to be hitting PRs and actually having a good time." You don't get that off an app,
No.
So I'm not saying don't use apps, but use apps alongside your own brain because that's a much more powerful tool.
Definitely. What a lovely note to leave it on. Use your own brain. It's a good one. I think so anyway. It kind of takes science out of everything, but yeah, it's like one of my golden rules. The number one golden rule of being a Titan athlete is just don't be an arsehole. So yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a good follow on. Just use your brain. Don't be an arsehole. It's nice.
Yeah. And my number one rule as a scientist is don't rely on science.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good one. Brilliant. Well, listen, Lee, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. Guys, if you have any questions for Lee or for myself, then obviously just shoot us a DM. I'll put all of the contacts on here for you. And I will look forward to the next episode of Don't Fear the Weight, where I shall have another guest in the hot seat talking about all things science, anecdotes, or just beating the bullshit, I suppose. So thanks again, very much so, and I will catch you very soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.